Hello and welcome. In this video on another instructional design model, I'm going to be talking about the SAM model of instructional design. So the SAM model of instructional design is standing for an acronym, which means Successive Approximation Model of Instructional Design. So there's a few things to know just about that name in general. Successive typically implies you're going to be building on something and there's a prescribed set of steps you'll be following. And then approximation means that you're making improvements over time. So the idea behind the SAM model is that you're developing prototypes or potential design solutions and you're iteratively or constantly cyclically improving on them over and over again, usually after you've gathered some feedback from different stakeholders. So specifically, this is a design or instructional design model that has the opportunity to review and evaluate and correct decisions, usually fairly early on when compared to other popular instructional design models like ADDIE. The SAM model of instructional design involves sketches and rapid disposable prototyping. One of the early phases of SAM is called a savvy start, where all of the individual stakeholders, whether it's the business side of an organization, the actual person facilitating the training, or whatever learning experience is going to be taking place, as well as the designers, all get together and they develop their own solutions and everyone shares them out in their prototypes. So they're not something that might be set in stone at the end, but they are some sketches here to get everyone thinking about these pieces. There are also, the SAM model specifically is a very efficient budget conscious method for going through an instructional design process. And that's why it's favored by some smaller groups that maybe have a small budget or need to get this done fairly quickly, or at least need to develop prototypes pretty quickly to give them to other groups to evaluate and get that feedback. So the SAM model has two phases, and really the scope of the project, and then I also think another factor is the scope or size of the organization determines what level or what phase of this model you would like to use. There's a two-phase model and a three-phase model of SAM. The one I have on the screen right now is the two-phase model, and this is from a source from ResearchGate that I have linked there if you want to enlarge it and see it on your screen. So the idea in this two-phase model is that you do design development all in the same one phase together, whereas the three-phase model breaks those up, ideally because if you're using the three-phase model, it might be a bigger project and you might need to dedicate a little bit more time and work in those as separate steps rather than together. So in this model, you start out in that preparation phase by gathering some background information. So what are our resources? Gather all the relevant resources we might need for this relevant topic or this training that we're going to be facilitating. And then you go engage in that savvy start. And the savvy start is a fancy way of saying, all of the individuals who are going to be part of this process, that's more than just designers. It could be facilitators for the training. It could be the administrator. If I'm thinking of a school setting, it could even be some of the additional student support people or even students themselves are involved in this savvy start. And you give everyone the goal or the objective that you've identified that needs to be solved here by a design solution. Then everyone goes through and they brainstorm and come up with their own solutions to this. So the idea behind this is that it's kind of disposable sketches. So everyone should go into this knowing that their design might not be the final one that makes it out of it, but everyone's contributing their ideas and solutions, and you get to see all of those in this setting. And that is the savvy start. So after you've engaged in that savvy start is when the designers look at all the potentials and we kind of move forward on the one that you think might be the ideal design solution, or you combine elements from all those to develop a potential design solution. And that's when we get into this project planning phase. So who's going to be doing what and start working on that design. All right, so once you've developed a vision for that design, you start building it and then you review it. And the review is where that ever important feedback piece comes in, where you roll it out to a different group of stakeholders, get their feedback, analyze it, collect that data, analyze it, and then apply some of the changes that feedback steered you towards. And then additionally, go through that whole process again if there's more design changes. And that's something that's unique with SAM when we look at some of the other models, is that there's a cyclical piece here. And I think this diagram does a really good job of doing that. So the idea again behind SAM is that there's not one perfect solution that you should come across in this design. That's the whole idea behind successive approximations that's in the SAM model name, is that there's not one perfect design solution. You're constantly improving designs throughout this process. And I think that's another reason why this might be one that's viewed as more efficient than ADDIE, is because you're developing your prototype pretty early on and all stakeholders are involved in that process. And you're not just working towards this one final solution or this one idea the whole time. You're developing that prototype in the physical design itself earlier so you get a sense of what it could look like in the end. So that is the two-phase model. Here is the three-phase model. And if you notice, there's just some slight differences here. Instead of the design and development phase being together, they are broken out into two separate entities in the three-phase model. So again, same piece here. You engage in that information gathering and collecting of resources, embark on that savvy start where everyone gets in the design mode, puts on their thinking cap and develops those sketches and those prototypes, and everyone gets to see those and presents those in that group setting. And the time spent on the savvy start, by the way, can vary. In some settings, that might be a half day. Other settings, it might take multiple days. Dr. Michael Allen is who came up with this process, and he has some differences in times on that. And this is Allen Incorporated is the company that really developed the whole SAM model in those pieces there. And they say on their website that it varies depending on what your aims are and the scope of the project. The iterative design phase, again, is cyclical. Similar to the last chart I showed you when these two steps were combined, this again is cyclical. So we see you develop a prototype, design, you make the actual prototype, and you review it. And again, repeat through this process until you have a design model that looks like it is ready for development and being created. And that's when we go through into the development phase here. And again, it is a circle here of development, implement, and evaluate. So gathering that feedback from the different stakeholders again. The key difference here is if you look at the bottom column, not bottom column, but bottom row of this three-phase SAM model is that there's an alpha, a beta, and a gold. That's a fancy way of saying different groups that you roll out your design, your developed prototype out to. And ultimately, by rolling it out to those different phases, you gather feedback from each phase where you can iteratively go through and improve and tweak that design again. So that's the 2 and 3 phase SAM model in a nutshell. So I find it really helpful when considering these pieces is to visualize what this might look like. In this example here, I'm giving you an example of a training as if I was a technology trainer and I'm trying to give teachers in my school building a training over Google Docs. Maybe that's a new tool that we want our teachers to use and maybe that our students will be using later on. So in this specific example, I'm going to be showing you a 2-phase example of SAM just for the simplicity of this problem. All right, so my first step here will be to gather all of the Google training materials that I currently have so I get an idea of current existing knowledge and even gather some resources on the web that I could utilize or other ones that have been made or delivered to teachers in my school in the past for trainings. And then I would consider my training goal. What do I want teachers to get out of this? Do I want them to be able to create a Google Doc to use in class? Do I want them to be able to create a hyperdoc that they utilize? And I land on that instructional goal. The next thing is when I engage in that savvy start. So that's when you bring in those stakeholders or your team. So in this example, I would want to maybe bring in other people who would be helping me facilitate this training. Perhaps I'm bringing in the principal who asked me to deliver this training in the first place. Maybe I bring in some of the actual teachers who are going to be participating in this training. They're my students, my teacher students in this example, so that they can also get an idea of what they would like to get out of this Google Docs training. So I get their perspective as well. So the next phase of this would be when I create a prototype of what this online training might be. So in this example, I did say it's online. So maybe I develop a sample module for the individuals here. And we all look at it, we all get some feedback, and they tell me what's good, what's not good. And I go through that process and keep improving my Google Docs training ultimately before I have to deliver it to the teachers. And that's where 4 and 5 come in. Make my prototype, ask for feedback, make changes, and then repeat this process as needed. So that's a very simple example of SAM in action in an educational context. So we consider the SAM model and compare it to other instructional design models that are out there, specifically ADDIE, which is one of the well-known, very famous instructional design models. SAM certainly involves earlier and more rapid prototyping than what ADDIE does. ADDIE considers developing a prototype after a couple of phases. You go through your needs analysis, you start to think about prototypes and design, but you're not really making it until the development phase. Whereas in this model, when you're engaging in that savvy start is when you first start making sketches and prototyping. So one of the core beliefs behind SAM is that you don't waste time talking about an idea of a design or gathering feedback about an idea, pie in the sky, something that actually hasn't come into fruition yet. In the Savvy Start, you sketch out what that design prototype might look like. So that when you gather the feedback and you're talking about that in that phase, it's not just an idea, it's an actual design at that point that people can sink their teeth into and give you more realistic feedback. All right. Another piece that's important here when we consider the SAM model and compare it to ADDIE is that it is built on this theory, SAM is, that if you develop prototypes earlier, continue to adjust, you're going to keep getting an improved model rather than waiting later on to where there's a single perfect design that emerges out of this. You accept the fact that no design is going to be perfect and you just keep improving it with every single meeting and feedback collection that you have, which is pretty different than ADDIE, where it's an idea and then you develop it into the actual product much later on. Here, you're developing the product earlier and improving it over time, also earlier. So again, the SAM model is quite a bit different than ADDIE, but there are some similarities too. You will see some similarities in language. Some of the steps have similar names. It is iterative, whereas ADDIE does have some iterative steps. It is a very process-focused model, the SAM model is. You go through these specific steps, and you also go through specific steps in ADDIE. So that could be something that could also be seen as a similarity between the two. It is a recursive process, which is a fancy way of saying that it's something that is cyclical. It works through itself multiple times, whereas ADDIE could have a very linear tendency as you move from needs analysis to design, to develop, to implement, to evaluate, whereas this could be back and forth a couple of times or go through the entire cycle over again. And like you even saw on the chart, I'm going to go back one slide, two slides. You even could go through this little design phase here, this iterative circle of design, prototype, review, multiple times before you even get into the development phase. So there are some recursive steps there. In addition, you also get the opportunity to collect feedback from a wider group of individuals in SAM, just because it requires the engagement of more stakeholders than what ADDIE may imply. Given you could bring in lots of different stakeholders at other points in ADDIE, but it's not necessarily something that's a requirement, whereas SAM requires you to bring in these different team members early on in that Savvy Start, and then also as you design and develop and roll this out in that alpha, beta, and gold pieces of the three-phase model. You are constantly getting feedback and constantly using that to improve and adjust your design so it's an improved, more perfect version. So it does give you a great opportunity to gather more feedback so you're more well-informed. However, on the flip side, in comparison to ADDIE, that might make this model a little bit more difficult to manage at times, depending on the scale and scope of your project and the amount of feedback that you've gotten. Sometimes having so many different voices suggesting changes or too many things to change could be overwhelming for groups and make it difficult to stay on a clear path towards a cohesive vision. So with that being said, sometimes ADDIE might have some leverage there over SAM when it comes to the feedback piece, but it is valuable to have feedback from different groups to widen your perspective and improve your product. So that is a really brief synopsis on the SAM model. I hope this has been helpful. And if you have any questions, please let us know and be sure to look through the slideshow and accompanying visuals that go on this site. Thanks.